Olá, bom dia a todos. Sou o Vitor Menini, estou hoje aqui no papel de mediador da nossa primeira conferência do dia. Antes de começar e apresentar nosso conferencista, eu gostaria de fazer um lembrete a todos e todas. As inscrições para o minicurso Arqueologia Experimental da Era Viking, Teoria e Prática, que será ministrada pela professora Luciana de Campos, estarão abertas até o início do minicurso, que é hoje, no dia 15, das 5 horas da tarde até as 7 horas da noite, tá? Então, agora nós passamos para a apresentação do nosso convidado, professor Jean Renaud, que fará uma apresentação intitulada The Vikings in France, From Raids to Settlements, né? Então, os vikings na França, até das emboscadas, né? Até os primeiros centros urbanos, né? Urbanificação. Ele foi professor de estudos escandinavos na Universidade de Caen, onde dirigiu o Departamento de Estudos Nórdicos, e também responsável pelo ensino das línguas escandinavas na Inspeção-Geral da Educação Nacional na França. Autor de vasta bibliografia acadêmica sobre o tema, mais de 35 livros sobre o tema dos vikings, entre eles The Vikings in France, de 1999, com uma nova versão em 2017. O professor Jean Renaud também faz parte do comitê científico das revistas Nordic e Scandia, Journal of Medieval Norse Studies. Professor Jean, welcome. Thank you for being here. It's a huge honor for us to welcome you to our event. Your work, together with Professors Régis Boyer, was extremely important to the beginning of Scandinavian studies in Brazil in the early 2000s. So we are very glad to have you here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I will talk about the Vikings in France. The Vikings in France, that is the Viking really in Francia Occidentalis, West Francia, the Western Frankish realm. And it all begins towards the end of the 8th century. Alcuin, the Northumbrian cleric, abbot of Saint-Martin de Tours in France by the time, who 6 years earlier lamented about the attack on the monastery of Lindisfarne in England, that was in 793, mentions in 799 in a letter to the Bishop of Salzburg the first appearance of the Vikings in France. And in this letter, Alcuin writes, I quote, "Pagan ships have done much damage to the islands of Aquitaine," that is the Bay of Biscay. "Some of them were destroyed, and about 105 pirates were killed on the beach." Now, on the slide, you have the location where everything happens. Alcuin doesn't give a precise location, really, but he probably refers either to Noirmoutier, the island of Noirmoutier, or further south, the islands of Ré or Oléron. Now, this raid could well relate to the Viking raiding activity in the Irish Sea area, and especially their attack on the Isle of Man in 798. Now, at the turn of the century, Charlemagne, the Carolingian emperor, takes defensive measures. He orders coast guards to be established in the region known as Neustria, which is the northwest corner of Francia. And he also orders ships to be constructed. But after his death, and he dies in 814, the coastal defense slowly loses its efficiency, and more incursions will occur, although they are not all mentioned in writing. The annals and chronicles of the time are, of course, our best approach to local events and their chronology, but they tell us mostly of the events that their authors have a special interest in. And of course, many incidents don't occur, but have existed, but don't occur in their texts. In 820, according to the contemporary Royal Frankish Annals, 13 ships after trying to plunder on the shores of Flanders and being beaten off by the defenders, make similar attempts on the estuary of the river Seine, without any success either. But there have also been several raids on Noirmoutier, the same island I was talking about before, during the years before. In fact, the abbot of the monastery there, Saint Philbert's monastery, has a new monastery built on the mainland at Dea. You can see it on the map. And that's where the monks went to escape the Vikings during the summer when they were roaming around. The easy access of the island and its important production of salt in salt marshes, from solar evaporation of seawater, certainly attracts the Vikings there. And the Vikings were always very well informed of where they were going and what they were going to do. And around 825, the monastery, that particular monastery on the island, is even fortified with the help of the French king. But after the raid on Noirmoutier in August 835, according to the Annals of Angoulême, when the Vikings are for once confronted with the Count of Herbauges, who happened to be there at the head of a troop of horsemen, then after that, the monks definitely evacuate the island. And they don't imagine, of course, at that time, when they do so, that it's the start of a long exodus for their community, their religious community, because it will end in Tournu, in Burgundy, 40 years later. And this has been the lot of many monks in France at that time. Now, Charlemagne's son and successor, Louis le Pieux, Louis the Pious, dies in 840. And while the bitter dynastic rivalry among his sons goes on, even after the partitioning of the empire in 843, the Vikings intensify their raids. Larger fleets now dare to sail up rivers, venture further and further inland, and over much longer periods. It is no longer simple summer piratical activity, but carefully planned attacks on the main centers of wealth and trade. And they establish bases, temporary overwintering camps, often on islands, on the coast, or on wide rivers. In 841, a fleet led by Oscerus, that's his Latin name, Osger, sails up the River Seine for the first time and attacks the city of Rouen on the 12th of May, 841, according to the Chronicle of Fontenelle. In 842, the Vikings destroy the thriving Frankish trading center of Kantovik on the river Canche, further north towards Flanders. I think. So, now, all this is described in the Annals of Saint-Bertin, which are the continuation of the Royal Frankish Annals, and they are quite trustworthy. That's why I often refer to them. On the 24th of June, 843, a fleet sails up the River Loire. The Annals of Angoulême called these Vikings Westfaldingi. So it probably means that they came from Westphal, but it's quite unusual because normally the clerics only speak of barbarians or pirates from the north, or Northmen, or even Danes, without really making any difference. They don't know really that there is a difference between Northmen and Danes, or Norway and Denmark, which was actually very different from today as well. Now, and those new Vikings, those Westfaldingi, they sack Nantes. They kill many people in the city, including Bishop Gunhard, after storming the cathedral, and they leave 5 days later to attack lower parts of Aquitaine. And they finally land on a certain island where they bring, I quote, their households over from the mainland, deciding to winter there. End of quote. And the following year, 844, still according to the Annals of Saint-Bertin, at least part of the fleet sails up the river Garonne as far as Toulouse, wreaking destruction there everywhere, says the Annals. But then the fleet seems to split, and the Viking launched the first raid on Iberia, Christian and Muslim Iberia, where they actually will suffer heavy casualties. Now, 845 is a memorable date. A large fleet of 120 ships, led by Reginarius, that is Ragnar, sails up the Seine and reaches Paris for the very first time, just before Easter. Paris is situated on a small island in the river Seine. It's l'Île de la Cité. It has no political role. It is not a capital, but it is a wealthy and renowned island city. So important in the eyes of the Vikings, of course. We have several written accounts of the event, especially, well, the Annals of Saint-Bertin, but also, for example, Émoin Saint-Germain's Miracles. And those different texts actually differ. They don't say exactly the same thing. But on the whole, Ragnar, taking advantage of King Charles the Bold's weakness, exacts a payment of 7,000 pounds of silver. And it seems that Ragnar attacks Hamburg on his way back to Denmark, and that on his return in Denmark, he dies a very horrible death, which is very clearly described in the text of the Miracles. Meanwhile, in Brittany, in 846-847, the Vikings launched their first major offensive, and Duke Nominoe eventually manages to buy them off, according to those Annals of Saint-Bertin. Brittany, I must of course say that it was not a real part of Francia. It was more or less independent, or they tried to be independent. And in Aquitaine, so the southwest part of Francia, Vikings sailed up the rivers, which you can see on the map, the Charente in 846, the Garonne, where they besieged Bordeaux over the winter of 847. They captured the city in early 848, and also the river Dordogne in 849. But in the 850s, the valleys of the Seine and of the Loire become the main targets of those Vikings year after year. In 856, two fleets led by Sidricus and Bernaud, that is Sigtryggur and Björn, according to the Chronicle of Fontenelle, they meet on the Seine in July and attack Paris in December. That same year, another fleet sailed up the Loire in April, and the towns of Angers, Tours, Blois, Orléans are sacked. And in April 858, they come close to Paris and capture Louis. He was the abbot of the Abbey of Saint-Denis, and his half-brother, Gozlin, who will later become Bishop of Paris. And both will be ransomed for a huge amount. In the summer 858, from the mouth of the Loire, a second raid is launched towards Iberia, but this time beyond the Gibraltar Straits. And in 859, these Vikings reached the French Mediterranean coast, looting and burning. They attack Narbonne and they winter in Camargue. And in 860, they sail up the river Rhône, so from the Mediterranean Sea there, and they sack Arles and Nîmes on the way. Now, this is also mentioned in the Annals of Saint-Bertin. But the local count of the area, Count Girard, manages to stop their progression. So they retreat and head back to the sea, and so south back to the sea and east to Italy. And they come back to the estuary of the Loire 2 years later in 862. And we don't really know what they have done in the Mediterranean Sea all that time. But they've probably been very busy. Now, Charles the Bold, Charles le Chauve, king of West Francia, must face several fronts. Of course, the Viking raids, but also the Bretons' provocations, and his other brothers' feuds. So he can't get rid of the Vikings, in fact, and there is even a third attack on Paris in January 861. So from that time onwards, King Charles changes his response from a reactive to a preventative basis. Town walls, which were generally Gallo-Roman walls, quite old, getting old, they are reinforced, and access on the rivers are restricted. They are restricted by building or by fortifying bridges. These fortified bridges, like those in Pitre, for example, on the river Seine, or Pont-de-Cé on the river Loire. Nevertheless, the Vikings will be able to sail up to Paris again in 865. But in 863, in Aquitaine, a Viking fleet led by Maur, sails up the Charente and sacks Angoulême and Saintes, where both the Viking chieftain and Turpion, the Count of Angoulême, are killed, according to the Chronicle of Aquitaine. The following year, the Vikings reach as far as Clermont in Auvergne. You can see it right in the middle of France, in the mountains, where Count Etienne, Stephen, if you prefer, is killed while defending the city. But Maur's successor, called Sigfridur, is defeated by Aquitanian troops near Saintes in 865, and raiding activity will actually decline in Aquitaine after that date. Underwater archaeology in the river Charente at Taillebourg, that is not very far from Saintes, has recovered about 10 years ago some 20 artifacts of Viking types. Here you have two of them on the slide: weapons, an anchor, small objects, a silver ring, and those boat-formed lead sinkers, which are quite heavy. They weigh about 1 kilo each. These artifacts are dated to the second half of the 9th century, which would confirm that the Vikings have occupied the site around Saintes and Angoulême long enough. Unfortunately, no traces of a camp have been found around the place yet, at any rate. In Brittany, Hastingus, another chieftain, Haustein, he's the chieftain of the Vikings of the Loire, and he is that for a whole decade. He plunders far and wide and even occupies the fortified town of Angers at one time. He occupied the city for several months, and Charles the Bold, with the help of the Breton Duke Salomon, besieged the city in 873. So they trapped the Viking there by diverting the course of the river Main, and the Viking couldn't use their ships any longer. This is according to another chronicler, Renaud of Prüm. Haustein eventually surrenders, the Viking chieftain, but he buys his freedom and promises to leave the kingdom. In fact, he will really do so, but not until 882. By that time, Salomon, the Breton Duke, is killed by a rival in 874. And during the following 15 years, civil war will reign will be the lot of Brittany. And but during that time, some Vikings will settle down along the coast, especially the southern coast of Brittany and the estuary of the river Vilaine, which is a river just north of the River Loire. King Charles the Bald, Charles le Chauve, is crowned emperor in 875, and he dies 2 years later. And his grandson, Louis III, who becomes king of West Francia, defeats part of a Viking army under the command of two powerful Viking chieftains named Gotafridus and Sigefridus in the contemporary sources, that is, Guthfridur and Sigfridur. Now, those two were operating in Frisia and Flanders. And the king's victory at the Battle of Saucourt-en-Vimeux in 881 is the theme of a famous Germanic poem, Ludwigslied. It's not every year that a French king wins a battle against Vikings. But Louis dies actually accidentally a year after, a stupid horse accident. And his younger brother Carloman is unable to resist much longer either. And he also dies of an accident in 884. And the Viking chieftain Guthfridur, the other one of the others there, is eventually murdered by the Frisians, and his army is wiped out. So this leaves us with, I know you know now, Sigfridur, and it will lead to the well-known year-long siege of Paris. Now, Sigfridur, coming from Flanders with his large fleet, joined by other fleets, more or less various sizes, enter the Seine in November 885 with the intention of sailing past Paris. 700 ships, 40,000 men. That's what Abbo, a local monk and eyewitness, a few years later, in his long Latin poem entitled Battles of the City of Paris, Bella Parisiciae Urbis. These numbers, quoted by Abbo, of course, are probably overestimated. But they suggest the exceptional size of the fleet, however. The young Count of Paris, Odo, and Bishop Gozlin, the one I mentioned before, refuse them passage. And Sigfridur, the Viking chieftain, decides to besiege the city. And he establishes successfully two main camps on each side of the Seine. The Parisians repulse several Viking assaults and manage to replenish their supplies and seek help from outside. Charles the Fat, the newly crowned emperor, arrived at last in September 886, but rather than fight, he allows the Viking to sail further up the river and to winter in Burgundy. He even promises them to pay them 700 pounds of silver on their return. Of course, the Parisians have resisted in vain, but as a result, too, the emperor is disposed the year after, in 888, which marks the end. It's an important date. It marks the end of the Carolingian Empire. So Eudes, the Count of Paris, the hero, is raised to the throne by the West Franks and the following year. Unfortunately, Eudes is not going to solve the Viking problem, and his successor in 898, Charles le Simple, Charles the Simple, will try to deal with it differently. At the turn of the century, two Viking chieftains appear respectively on the Seine and on the Loire, where they both will play a considerable role. They are named Rolver, Latinized in Rollo, or in French Rollon, and Rognvaldur, Ragnold. Now, to make it easier to understand, I will first deal with Rollo and his successful settlement in the future Normandy, And then I will say a few words about Rognvaldur and his failure in Brittany. So in what is to become Normandy, during the last decade of the 9th century, some Vikings have already settled in the lower Seine valley, having taken over monastic harbors, several monastic harbors abandoned by the monks. We know nothing for sure about Rollo's origins, and we know nothing about his definite arrival in Francia, because he's not mentioned in contemporary sources. And that's interesting. He's not mentioned in contemporary sources until 918. But it's not impossible that he may come from Norway and around 890, but nothing absolutely certain about Rollo. It's also about this time that another completely anonymous Viking buries his treasure near Elbeuf. Elbeuf is in the valley. It's not far from the Seine. It's in the valley, and there are a few smaller ingots, 2 Carolingian coins. I think I skipped. Sorry, this is what I want to show you. A few small. This is part of the treasure. Well, the top, at any rate, is part of the treasure. The coins and the ingots. There are some of the coins are minted in Britain, in England, and it suggests that this Viking comes over from the British Isles. It was often the case. Vikings went to England and then moved south to France afterwards. The 2 oval brooches you also see on the slides, they were found in a female grave at Pitre. It probably belonged to a woman who was a camp follower to the Viking in the area around Rouen, but we have no information about this lady. And likewise, dated from the late 9th century, 2 Thor hammer pendants, you have one on the photo here, were found, and this is almost the whole lot of the artifacts found in Normandy. We have only few artifacts from Normandy. Anyway, Rollo possibly meets the Archbishop of Rouen at an early stage and agrees to spare his defenseless city. But Rollo probably plunders far and wide elsewhere than in the valley of the Seine, and in July 911 he besieges the city of Chartres. Now, Burgundian and Frankish forces come and fight, and they manage to liberate the city, and the Vikings are defeated and retreat back to Normandy, or back to the Seine. It is under these circumstances that King Charles the Simple decides to negotiate with Rollo, and they both, King Charles and Rollo, meet at Saint-Clair, halfway between Paris and the river and Rouen. Now you can say it's Saint-Clair-sur-Epte. It's a bit difficult to see on the map, but it's right. It's just where underneath the word Vexin you will find it. Vexin is the area. Now, unfortunately, we have no written records. We don't even know if there were written records of the so-called Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, despite its great importance. But we have only the long account of Dudon, from a cleric from Saint-Quentin, from the northern part of France, who writes the history of the Normans, but he writes that 100 years later, and in honor of the Dukes of Normandy, so he's not always very accurate and honest with history. Now, from what we know, the king grants Rollo a territory already more or less under Viking control. And it is meant to be a genuine donation. This is important. Rollo is not considered as a vassal. The Vikings will have to defend their new territory against further attacks, and they also will have to become Christians. Now, on accepting these terms, Rollo acquires Pays de Caux and Roumois, which you can see on the map there. This is according to Fleudoir and his history of the Church of Rouen. And these are areas which correspond to present-day Upper Normandy, really. So Rollo becomes Count of Rouen, and he will be baptized. But not all his men will do so readily. We know that from a letter sent to the Pope, and which the Pope replied to. And in his reply, the Pope encourages patience and leniency. Well, Rollo apparently keeps the Carolingian organization of his new county, of his new territory, and he doesn't enforce much Scandinavian legislation. We only find possible traces of it in the Norman customary law written down at the end of the 12th and beginning of the 13th century, and some older documents written by clerics as well. Now, but just 2 or 3 things. The right of exile, on the slide you can see the names written on the bottom left. Ulak. Now, Ulak is what you hear about in those documents from Old Norse utlager, which means banishment. And this is mentioned in a charter dated 1050 for the first time. Another thing is the Duke's monopoly on shipwrecks, the so-called droit de varec, as you can see on the slide, vogrek in Norse, meaning, it includes anything being washed ashore, this includes a right on whales and sturgeon. And in fact, it reminds us of the Danish Jutland law from 1241, which states that treasures, jetsam, and fish larger than sturgeon are to be the Danish king's property. But apart from that, practically nothing else. As far as information is concerned, there are no details, for example, of any special military structures. Has Rollo got his own bodyguard, his levy, his liv? Possibly, but reference to this appears nowhere. The only hint, though, of such a bodyguard could be the surname, the personal name, which became a family name afterwards, Uskay. You can see it written there as well. The name Uskay is attested in 1263, and it derives from the Norse huskarl, which becomes housecarl in English. Likewise, there is no mention of any leithanger, of levy, of troops, allowing him to levy an army. There is no document to state it. So, Rollo also marries. He marries Poppa. Poppa is the daughter of a Frankish count. That is certain. What is less certain is that we don't know which count. There are 2 possibilities. But anyway, they have a son, Guillaume Longue-Épée, William Longsword. He was not named Longsword when he was born, of course, just much later. And they also had a daughter, Gerlock, in Norse Gerlog, who was baptized Adèle, and this Adèle will marry a Count of Poitou, Guillaume Tête d'Étoupe, that is William Towhead. So the importance of this is that Rollo, in that way, becomes one of the important leaders in Francia. In fact, he is one of les grands, as we say in French, the great, the important people. And they are friends at times, but of course, mostly rivals at other times. And Rollo really must fight to keep a hold on his county, and unsuccessfully tries to extend it to the north and west of the Seine, towards Picardy. But in 924, he manages to exact concessions and further territories to the west. According to Flodoard, the new king, King Rodolphe, Raoul, reluctantly cedes him more land beyond the Seine, extending the county of Rouen to the river Vire. The river Vire, in fact, it includes the area called Bessin, which you can see here. It's the area around Bayeux, and but it's an area where already other groups of Viking settlers were, and these Viking settlers show much hostility to the new Scandinavian elite of Rouen. And there is no absolute evidence that Rollo gains real control of the new area. And in fact, Rollo dies. We don't know precisely when, but probably around 932. And we know he was buried in the Cathedral of Rouen, but we're not sure. Yeah, well, I mean, we know, but only for sources 200 years old later. But he was buried there. No. In fact, it was even exceptional, such a burial in a cathedral at the time. But expansion of Normandy goes on. In 933, still according to Flodoard, King Raoul grants Rollo's son and successor, William Longsword, Cotentin and Avranchin. That's the peninsula, the western peninsula of Normandy, which you can see on the map. It seems that the less inhabited northern part of it, which is called La Hague, actually was already had been already settled by independent Vikings, completely independent, not coming together with Rollo, but coming mostly from the Irish Sea area, it seems, from place names, evidence. Now, one of the names, actually, the name of a small range of fields today, fields overseeing the Bay of Écalgrin, which is a little bay at point of the headland there, the Bay of Écalgrin. These fields are called Le Tinglant, and it probably witnesses the existence of a Viking local assembly in that area. It's a microtoponym, but it's of Norse origin. It's a compound of thing, meaning assembly, and land, meaning land. Thing, land, Tinglant in French now. It has its exact equivalent in England, in Cumbria, in Cumberland, where Norwegian Vikings also settled there. And today it's called Fingland with an F like France, but it was attested in 1279 like Thingland, as Thingland with TH. So the equivalents seem to speak for a good witness of the existence of this assembly, local assembly there. The new Norman aristocracy of Rouen gradually departs from the North. William Longsword is murdered. He was murdered in 942, and his murder is a threat to the fragile existence of Normandy. But his young son, very young, he was 10 to 12 years old at the time, Richard I, who succeeds him, eventually regains control of the situation and rules firmly until 996. And so does his own son after him, Richard II, who enforces political stability and conspicuous economic progress. Now, the three grunts which built Normandy, that is, in the one in 911, 924, and 933, have enlarged the Scandinavian annexation to an area roughly reproducing the former ecclesiastical province of Rouen. So the archbishop was very happy because he had lost the western part to the Breton archbishopric of Dole. But now, well, things were going to take a better shape, and Normandy was born, first as a county, but Richard II already calls himself a duke. That's why people often refer to Normandy as a duchy at the time, even from the start, although it wasn't. It was only a county. In the 11th century, the Scandinavian flavor of this duchy fades more and more. Somehow, the author of Book of Miracles, the Miracles of Saint Wulfran, almost logically writes, I quote, Rollo was not long in bringing together men of various extractions and crafts, shaping all races into one single people. Now, while the Vikings integrate the local community, their language declines rather quickly, but many Norse words remain in use, some about everyday life, others because perhaps they had no really precise equivalent locally. And the Norman dialect today, actually it has practically died out nowadays, but still, the Norman dialect has kept 100 or 200 words from Norse origin, out of which modern French has borrowed a few, or not very many, but still a few. Such words as you have on the slide here, like un homard. Un homard, it's the Norse humar, a lobster, une vague, vauger, a wave, une crique, criquet, a nook, le duvet, dun, down, une girouette, vederviti, a vein, the verb débiter, bita, to cut into bits, regretter, the verb regretter, grauta, to weep. And still today, a French sailor currently uses between 30 and 40 Norse loan words without knowing it, far from it. Such words as we have a few here, like la quille, it's kjöler, the keel of a ship, a tolle, tholler, a thole pin, les haubans, hoofdbender, the stays, the verb cingler, sigla, to sail, the verb aller, hala, to haul, or gréer, greva, to rig. Now, some of the Norse loan words have also been used very early in Normandy to name places. Not all these words, of course, but some of them. And it gives microtoponyms, such as those you have here, la dalle, la londe, le torp, le tuy. Now you see, la dalle, une dalle was the name used to describe a valley. Dalur. Londe is the word for lunder. Therefore, la londe. Every time the French word, the French place name has a definite article. It's really the valley and the wood. Le torp is the isolated farm, thorp. Le tuy, the clearing, thwaite, and so on. Of course, although the country is already inhabited when the Vikings arrive, the Scandinavian settlers named many topographical features and their new dwellings. Now, these place names allow us to draw the boundaries of the settled areas, because not the entire Normandy was settled by the Vikings, of course. And the settling also inside these settled areas, where you can see a substantial and lasting influence. Now, when you speak of a substantial and lasting influence of Scandinavians in Normandy, it by no means it means a deep upheaval. It's not a revolution. Still, over 100 place names in Normandy and in Bec. And Bec is Bekkur, which means a brook, like the one you have here on the slide, Brikbeck, Bekkur, and Brekka, the slope. So Brekka, Bekkur means the brook down the slope. Because originally it's often a detail which is named like this, and later on it becomes the name of a village, but much later on. Brikbeck today is a small town. It's no longer a brook. And now you have other examples here, like apto and the word to, coming from toft, which means a piece of land, and then the farm built on that piece of land. Now the place name apto, where the first element is epli, an apple, or the name Turmeto, where you have the Viking personal name Thormodr, so it's Thormodstoft, or Thormodstoft, the farm or the piece of land of Thormodr. And you have other different kinds, such as Karkebu, where you have the word beer, meaning either a farm or a village. And Kirkja here means a church. So Kirkjabyr is the village with the church. Lindbøf, lind is the lime tree, and booth is a shanty. Ulgat, compound with holur, hollow, and gata, the path. Sandvik, vik is the bay, or the little bay, or the inlet, and sandur, the sand, so it's a sandy bay. Tufrekal, well, there you have the residence or the building of the Skauli of Thorfröder, and Thorfröder is the Viking's name, so Viking personal name. Ketu, same thing. Ketu is made out of Ketil, which is the name, personal name, and Holmur, an islet, small island. Holmur describe both small islands or islets in the sea, as well as on rivers or lakes or marshes. And many personal names of settlers, Viking settlers, having received landed estates, have also been combined with the local element ville, actually the Latin villa, which means a farm, an estate. So you have plenty of names ending in ville in Normandy today with a Viking personal name as first element. And a few examples here. Gunni in Gonville, Skuli in Ekulville, Thorolfur, Trouville, Barney in Barneville, Haustein in Attinville, Colville is made of Colli, and lots of others. And thanks to the Vikings' active integration, their personal names are not only attested in place names, many ancient and also in many ancient documents, written documents. But later they will become French surnames. That is, when family names are forged in Normandy in the 15th century. In fact, they are still very common in Normandy today. You can meet Monsieur Toutain or Monsieur Osmond or Osuf, and their name actually comes from Fils Toutain, Fils Osmond, that is son of Thorstein, Osulfur, Osmundur, Thorgils, and so on. So it's quite interesting. On the other hand, there is, as I said before, very little archaeological evidence in Normandy, apart from the artifacts that I've mentioned. Well, we only have a few swords and a few axes, generally found by chance in the River Seine. And we also have a couple of stirrups, but that's about all we have. Now, Let's turn to Brittany. It's a shame because you can't see the dates, but I can't. Can I do something about it? No. Oh, sorry. No. Oh, sorry. You won't see the dates. Now, following the death of the Breton Duke Alain le Grand, Alain the Great, in 907, Brittany is left without a leader, and Brittany is dramatically disorganized and weakened, and it becomes the focus of Viking activity, and even more so after the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, because the Vikings who couldn't sail up the River Seine anymore, well, they all dashed down towards Brittany and the River Loire. And the most spectacular attack concerns Saint Guénolé's monastery. This you can see on the map, at any rate. It's at the western point of Brittany, and it's at Landévennec, and it was sacked and burned in 913, probably by Autor and Roaldur, probably or possibly because Autor and Roald are mentioned in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle afterwards, and they are the two chieftains who plunder the coast of Wales. Of course, many monks and many aristocrats flee from Brittany to England, many of them, but elsewhere as well, and it allows Scandinavian settlers to, it allows Scandinavians to settle here and there along the south coast of Brittany in various groups. And they establish bases and, tentative settlements. Not always successful, but some of them will be, temporarily. Then in 919, a large fleet under the command of a powerful chieftain, Reinvaldur, Ragnold in French, enters the estuary of the Loire and lands at Nantes. And we know even less about his origins than about Rollo's. So we don't know much. By the early 920s, Reinvaldur has enough authority to exert great pressure and gain political control. According to Fleuderat's Annals, Nantes and Brittany are ceded to him by Robert, the Marquis of Neustria, after an unsuccessful 5-month siege of the city of Nantes by the Franks in 921. So we don't know the precise details of this agreement either, but afterwards, Reinvaldur obviously just keeps reigning far and wide, first in Aquitaine and then Auvergne. Then he possibly helps Rollo plunder Picardy in 923. He negotiates with Hugh the Great and William of Aquitaine in 924. And it is while devastating Burgundy early in 925, according to Fleuderat's Annals, that he is trapped by combined Burgundian and Frankish forces on the upper Seine and manages to escape, but probably dies soon after. And this is the last time we hear about him. He has acted as a warrior first and foremost. So he has acted very differently from Rollo. 2 years later, Hugh the Great, Hugues le Grand, in 927, and the Count Herbert of Vermandois besieged the Loire Vikings in Nantes for 5 weeks without success. And they finally concede the Nantes area as part of a new agreed peace. That's what Fleuderat writes in his Annals once again. Fleuderat is quite accurate. No mention is made of Brittany this time. It's just Nantes. However, after a Breton rebellion in 931, it seems that a chieftain called Håkon maybe, has become the new ruler. In fact, beside Nantes and the estuary of the Loire, there are other small Scandinavian settlements in the Vanté area, especially on the coast, Vanté or Morbihan, you have it on the map, and Cornouailles. and this is the southern coast, and on the northern coast in Léon, Trégor, and the area of Dole further east. But we don't know if there is a link between those various settlements. Some of them are rural, others are more military-minded, and we don't know either if Nantes has a real influence on the whole of them, or on them either. Anyway, in 935, Alain Barbetorte, Alain Twisted Beard, grandson of Alain the Great, Alain le Grand, who has grown up in exile in England, returns to Brittany. He lands on the north coast, where he defeats a Viking force near Saint-Brieuc. You can see it on the map as well, I hope. It has been suggested that an ancient fortification at Perron there could have been reoccupied by the Vikings. It's not sure, but the most significant find would be a coin minted in York between 900 and 925, and it would also fit with a possible destruction of that particular camp by fire in 935, so perhaps when the Vikings occupied it. And the following year, according to the Chronicle of Nantes, the Chronicle of Nantes is a later, rather untrustworthy source, Alain marches across the country from north to south, and he reaches Nantes, and he storms the fortress there, and the Vikings retreat to their ships. Now, Duke Alain and the Bretons will spend the next 3 years fighting and defeating Vikings throughout Brittany. And their final victory will be at Trans, just east of Dole, in 939, completely to the northeast of the map, with the help of the Count of Rennes, who was called Juel Béranger. So, having got rid of the Vikings for good, Alain Twisted Beard can finally claim his inheritance, Brittany, and even keep Brittany free from Viking attack until his death in 952. Apart from a few Viking swords, and which were found by chance in the River Loire, the main archaeological evidence in Brittany, in opposition to Normandy, is, however, quite exceptional. It's a ship burial of the cremation type found in Norway. And it was found, I come back to the slide before, on the little island of Groix, if you can see it, just south of Vanté, on the Vanté coast. Now, the partially eroded mound, it was an eroded mound on a cliff edge, and it was threatening to be swallowed up by the sea and then the waves. So it was excavated in a hurry. It's never good. And on top of that, in 1906, of course, not according to modern scientific standards. But it contained a burnt longship of about 11 meters in length, 1 meter long Viking ship, with the remains of 2 people, obviously a rich Viking chieftain, and a younger person, who might be a relative or slave, we don't know, along with dogs and birds and many objects. Here you have only a few of them: weapons, riding gear, a gold ring, tools, an iron cauldron, bronze vessels, gaming pieces, and so on. Now, the burial is usually dated to the second half of the 10th century, simply on the base that it seems that it is the decoration on one of the swords is of Mammon style. You know, there are 6 styles in the Viking art, and Mammon style is one of them. And well, this dating is not quite sure, because it's very difficult to see, really. So, who was buried there? Of course, we don't know. It might be a Viking chieftain closely connected with Brittany, in the 950s, but in the 950s there aren't so many Vikings anymore around the place. Or it could also be a Viking in connection with the raids, the Viking raids to Iberia, because there were more Viking raids to Iberia in the 960s and 970s, and he could be one of those going to or coming back from Iberia. We don't know, and we will never know. Well, I will more or less conclude on this. I have tried to summarize, but it's very difficult to summarize the considerable amount of Viking activity during the 9th and 10th century in present-day France. Raids everywhere along the coast, North Sea, Channel, Atlantic, Mediterranean, and up the main rivers, Seine, Loire, Charente, Garonne, Rhône, and even as far inland as Burgundy and Auvergne. Beside the history of France at that time is very complex, and it's also difficult to follow. So anyway, all this is mostly documented by clerics, but these clerics don't always bring reliable information, and as you have noticed, we have extremely meager archaeological finds to help us too. However, the foundation of Normandy is one of the most interesting long-lived Viking settlements in Western Europe, and the only one which was maintained in the Frankish realm. I have also to say, however, that this is the end, that Normandy, in the course of centuries afterwards, has developed a real myth of its own. And this myth, which was encouraged by Dudo of Saint-Quentin and the monks from the start, culminated in 1911, when the millennium of Normandy was celebrated in Rouen. But this myth is incredibly strong still today. Of course, this is a myth, and this is the myth of a sheer Viking ancestry and heritage. And of course, it's completely wrong. Well, thank you for your attention.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Professor Renaud. It was a great conference. We have a couple of questions here. I will start with my own questions, and then I will pass to other questions that we received. I was really compelled about the material culture that you mentioned. You also mentioned that there are few of those. And I was wondering around the written sources, if the material culture actually appears there. For instance, we are aware of the coinage that the Franks used during that period, that from 9th century, for example. And I was wondering if any of this material culture is mentioned in any of the written sources. Are you what?
The Vikings didn't use coins. They
Absolutely
break and to meet them, but no. In written documents, no. Well, in the written documents, the only mention of well, it's not even coins, but it's mention of silver, because the Vikings want a number of pounds of silver, whatever kind they are. So when somebody says, well, there was a ransom of 2,000 pounds of silver, you don't know, there's no description of which coin they were used.
Okay, sure, yeah.
And it's Normandy, however, is one of the earliest Scandinavian-like territories to mint coin. Already William Longsword had minted his own coins, but they don't appear in written documents.
Sure.
And it's post-Viking. It's no longer Viking activity.
Sure. Yes.
It's already Normandy.
Okay. What about tributes? Did the Franks pay any tributes to the Vikings? Because you mentioned basically the raids and the settlements,
Yes.
but also you talked about these streets and how they related politically. And I was wondering about tributes, if there were any sums paid to these Vikings, and how did that work in that region?
Yeah, well, the Viking kings paid tributes.
Okay.
I mentioned this Charles the Bold, for example, but in fact, something which I haven't mentioned at all, and I skipped, but I couldn't say everything. But the Frankish kings have tried to pay the Vikings to work for them as mercenaries. And not even the Aquitanian Duke King Pepin II as well. He paid Vikings to help him against the Frankish king. The Britons have tried that. So Vikings get money and honor or don't.
Sure.
You take the example of a Viking called Velundur. It was in 860. Just before the attack of Paris in 861. And in 860, this Viking chieftain, Volundur, arrives from Flanders, and the king gets in touch with him and asks him if he could not get rid of the Vikings, the other Vikings. There are lots of Viking troops, to get rid of those other Vikings who have been settled down on an island in the Seine. And Volundur says, "Okay, I want." The king suggests I give you 3,000 pounds of silver. But he promises, but he has no ready money, of course. So in the meantime, Volundur sails over to England, plunders there, comes back to France the year after. When he comes back to France the year after, in 861, after the attempted attack on Paris. And he asks for 5,000 pounds instead of 3,000 to start with, and we suppose he gets them. At any rate, he attacks and chases these Vikings from the River Seine as planned, but in fact, the Vikings on the Seine gave extra money to help do it quietly and not too briskly, and those Vikings will come back. Well, they won't be. They will go back to sea and back up rivers again. So tributes have been paid as well. I mean, not just tributes, but also ransoms. Many times. Sometimes we hear of monks being, or for example, monasteries being plundered and monks being captured, and then some people, either abbeys or rich lords, buy their freedom again. So these are not ransom, but tributes. Not tributes, but ransom. I mean, yeah.
Great. I do have one more, and then I will pass to the questions from the audience. We were talking before the conference about the violence and how everyone was violent during that period in Europe, and I was actually wondering how, in studying these raids and settlements and contacts and trades, how can we reposition this concept of violence and get a better grasp on these Vikings besides the violent label? Because you mentioned that the problem probably was how the priests ended up writing about the Vikings. So I was wondering if retelling the history is a way of also recreating this concept. I would like to hear a little more on that.
Yeah, well, it's true that it's mostly the clerics who give us a clue of what the Vikings are. They didn't use the word Vikings, of course. They said, as I said before, barbarian, pirate, and so on. And but they only know the Vikings when they are at work. They have no idea what they are like at home. So the only image that they give us, not only of violence because they are violent, but everybody is violent at that time. But there's one more thing which is even worse. Not only this, they say that the Vikings are violent and the people must suffer, but they also say that the people must suffer of this violence because they haven't been good Christians.
Mm-hmm.
This makes the people feel even more culprits. Right? So it's difficult from raiding operations to have a good idea of what the Vikings are at home. I could take a small example. Ibn Fadlan in Russia, on the Volga, he meets a Viking chief, and he meets him, but he comes to his burial, and he meets Vikings there, and he describes the Vikings, but the Vikings are on their expedition on the Volga, far from home, and he says, he describes them as very filthy people who spit in the water they wash their face with, and so on. But this is contradicted by all other sources, material, archaeological, West European sources. So Ibn Fadlan was not perhaps the best person to describe Viking hygiene on an expedition, and being a Muslim himself and washing his face and feet 5 times a day, because it was the law of Koran.
Sure. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. So now I will pass to the questions on the audience, and the first one comes from André. He's talking about the toponymy. You mentioned how the place names in Brittany and Normandy especially have a connection with the Viking incursions over there. But his questions is specifically mentioning are there any specific regions in Brittany and Normandy? Is there a way to trace or map the places that have names influenced by the Old Norse language? Is it possible to map specifically?
Yes, but before I answer the question, of course, you must insist on the fact that there are so many of them.
Sure.
Well, there are quite a few. Nothing compared to Yorkshire, for example, and it's only in Normandy, and it's not even all over Normandy, but just in the part of Normandy that was really settled down by Vikings. In Brittany, there are very, very, very few, and it's difficult to assert, even when it looks like one. There are always doubts lying behind. But anyway, yes, of course, we have plenty of. Well, we have 2 things to start from. The oldest maps we have, but also all the oldest documents, these ancient documents written by clerics, among other things, and charters and law documents and description of gifts and so on, in abbeys from one monastery to another, one duke to a monastery, and so on. And in these texts, you have place names, and when you say, well, I think this place name looks very much of Norse origin, you can't say, well, it must be without just like this. You have to see how old, how far back in past it is attested, and the farthest the better, of course. And yes, and see if it's an area which is suitable. See if for such a place name. And there are plenty of, but written documents and maps, old maps and written documents are essential. That's why it's very easy there are plenty of place names which sound Norse, but you can't say they are because you have no old attests of them.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. We have 2 more questions. One comes from Professor Johnny Langer. That is a quite large question, and I will try to summarize it. And if you could read there, it's also in English, so you could try to read also. But I will try my best to ask the full question. So Professor Langer is mentioning the most famous phrases from a Norman source called from Dude of St. Quentin, the Gesta da Norma 11. And the saying is, we are Danes, yet what authority does your Lord discharge? They replied, none, for we all of equal power. So they're mentioning the equal power. And Professor Langer is asking if this phrase was widely used as evidence of a mistaken Norse egalitarian society during the Viking Age, especially by 19th century historians. And his question is, how do you perceive this historical context and production of this information, and also the content? So,
yeah, I've already said a few words about Dudo. He's not reliable. That's the problem. In fact, you see, when Dudo writes his history of the Normans, he's doing it because he's been asked to by Richard I, and then later by Richard II to finish the work. The two Norman dukes, while Normandy is getting bigger and greater and greater, and Dudo has to make the best out of the dukes of Normandy. He must make them as brilliant as possible. So when he starts writing his history, in the first chapter, he depicts the actions of Halstein. Halstemus is called him Halstein, this famous Halstein. And he describes him as the bad Viking, the villain. In fact, he places into his hands all the worst things that happened to France before Rollo comes along, because Rollo is the second chapter, and Rollo is described as the Duke, the one who will become the first of the Duke line, and he describes him as the good Viking. But if we forget about the good Viking, just take Halstein, and it's him, Halstein, who says, when he's asked by, it's Dudo who imagines this happening a couple of 100 years ago, earlier, of course, it's his imagination, who says, we are all equal. That is one of Dudo's, I don't know where he got it from, but it's one of Dudo's fancies, I suppose. But of course, what Dudo's write and what the clerics write afterwards is taken up again, especially in the Romantic period. But we must not believe everything that the clerics and people like Dudo writes about. Not about, but write simply. I don't know if I answered the question, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. So thank you. We have one more here, a little wider scope, but mentioning the medieval narratives that are written in French or Old French. So Professor Lucian is asking, is there any French medieval narrative or poetry that features these Viking incursions or invasions as a theme, or only certain elements like characters, for such example as Iseult or Isolde? So are you aware of any narratives in French that mention are there any connections with that?
No, not really. Besides, at one time, at that time, people had a confusion between the Celts and the the Vikings.
Sure.
There is a narrative about Brittany, and I forget the title now, but there's a confusion between Charlemagne and the Vikings of the time. It's a mixture. It's a mixture of. We don't have Icelandic sagas in France, you know.
Sure. Okay. Yes. Yeah. So one last point, mentioning your conclusion here. You talked about how this myth of the Vikings came up to Brittany and Normandy, and I was wondering about this.
It's only Normandy.
Oh, sure. Yes.
Norman. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So Normandy, and you mentioned the evening cheese blocks, the mentions to the Vikings. So what about these uses of this past or history today? Like, are there still any connections? How do you think that historians and historiography can dialogue with that to deconstruct the myth and pose better questions or a better grasp of how or what did actually the Vikings influence over in Normandy?
Historians have tried to deconstruct this for years now. I think second half, at least the second half of the 20th century, and people, well, they just carry on believing that their forefathers are Vikings and that sort of thing. Yeah,
Sure.
It's almost hopeless.
Sure. Yeah, it's a very cumbersome work for historians.
I think there has been some progress, though I mustn't be too naughty with
Sure.
Norman people.
Sure.
I live in Normandy. I'm not Norman, but I live in Normandy.
Okay. Yes. Nice.
I will be banished.
Okay. So, Professor Renaud, these are all the questions that we have for you and from the audience. I would like to thank you very much. It was very compelling. I really enjoyed and how you construct your argument here. So, in the name of the whole group of our nucleus of studies, I would like to express our gratitude for having you with us today. It was great. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I was very happy to be with you today. Thank you.
Thank you. So now I have to do a little Portuguese here for our audience.
You're welcome.
So, bom, pessoal, terminamos então a conferência. Acabei de agradecer ao professor Renaud e gostaria de lembrar que nós voltamos às 15 horas com uma conferência de Kevin Smith sobre a arqueologia do Ragnarok. E, por último, hoje ainda temos a primeira mesa redonda intitulada A História dos Vikings, às 19 horas. Esperamos todos vocês lá. So, thank you very much again, Professor Renaud, and we hope to see you again some other time. Thank you.
Thank you, too. Bye.